Hello and welcome to another episode of Why the Beatles Matter. No, you do not need to adjust your screen. No, you didn't press an archival episode of the Principal Liner Notes podcast. This is the much valued and appreciated return of my friend and fellow educator and music aficionado, Erin Austin. Erin, welcome to Why the Beatles Matter.
Thank you. I'm super stoked.
I am as well, and I tell you, you were near the top of the short list after Paul and Ringo to be a guest on this podcast because I do know on many levels as not only a fan but as a parent, as an educator, as someone who is passionate about the music, you have many responses, visceral responses to why the Beatles matter. And I think if we could, I'd be curious to see and learn what was your first step into the Beatles world? What was it that ignited your passion for this band?
Super easy. One of my very, very first memories, like in life, is of what ultimately became my favorite song ever, and it's Imagine. So when I was born at the end of 1979,
Mhm.
and so when I was a kid, MTV still played music,
Yes, I
which
remember
was,
those days.
yeah, the M actually stands for music. And um, I have very, still to this day, very, very vivid memories of sitting in front of the TV
Mhm.
watching the video for Imagine, because
Mhm.
in those days there weren't a lot of videos.
Right.
So the video for Imagine was actually on pretty frequently.
Mhm.
And just being young, and young kids are like all over the place. But that video, that music, it came on and I stopped every time, completely transfixed by what I was hearing and what I was seeing,
Mhm.
like that room of all white
Yes.
and John singing, and the piano just brings you down.
Yeah.
And it stuck with me. And even now, like, so my own kids are 5 and 8 years old. And when they were babies, that is the song I would sing to them that just calm them down,
Yeah.
just relax them. So that's my first memory, not a Beatles song, but a Beatles singing.
Right. It is such a beautiful song and it's timely because, we're just kind of wrapping up the first week of the new year. And, typically in Times Square, when the ball is dropped, after Old Lang Syne or whatever, they immediately play John Lennon's Imagine. And that video that you mentioned, at the time they called them promo films. And there's just so many beautiful ethereal moments in that video. And the one that comes to mind is it's towards the end of the song. Yoko has opened the curtains, the windows, and she walks over as John is playing at that white piano, that iconic white piano, and she sits down next to him on the piano bench, and she's looking to the side, and there's at one point where she looks and steals a glance at him, and he looks at her right at the same time, and they have this beautiful smile. There's just this kind of just beautiful moment between the two of them, and to me that just kind of sums up their love story. Um, but it is such a beautiful song, and I know I too um, would that was part of my own three daughters lullaby sequence as well. So just such a beautiful, iconic song, really is. So. I like the fact that you mentioned when MTV played music. Those days are gone forever. Um, what can let's continue on that pathway. So Imagine, which is a solo song. How did you go? How did it? Where did it lead you after that?
Well, I was lucky enough, I did not realize this at the time, but when I was a kid, it was lucky that my parents had the rule that whoever was driving was in control of the radio.
Mhm.
So it was always tuned to things that were of their generation. And so lots of Beatles on the radio. And my dad in particular would always, from a pretty young age, play like Name That Band. And
Mhm.
then going from Name That Band to Name That Singer, Name That Guitar Player, things like that. So it was definitely in the car growing up, sing-alongs with Beatles, everybody from that kind of 60s, 70s era for sure. And so that was there in my upbringing. And then when I was in high school is when the Beatles anthologies came out.
Mhm.
And so then it was like just this massive cultural resurgence of everything Beatles. And I remember watching the movies for Help and Hard Day's Night with my best friend, and just they're hilarious.
Yeah.
They're so funny. And just getting reintroduced to them at an age where it was like, okay, I'm going to go listen again, but also read what I can about them. And their their songs, to me, are timeless, which makes good sense because every musician I've ever loved cites the Beatles as inspiration. So they just don't go away ever.
Yeah. Yeah, that when the anthology series came out, circa 95, that was I love how you phrase it as in terms of a cultural resurgence because it was. And as a fan, Beatles were everywhere. The re-releases of certain films, ABC, with their promotional campaign, the release of the two new Beatles songs and Free as a Bird and Real Love, and it very much um an echo or kind of a modern day Beatlemania. And it was exciting, and fresh and upbeat during that time. And I know that you in addition to the Beatles, um, are very passionate about others. And I think about Prince and his influence from the Beatles. Namely around the album Around the World in a Day, which I remember when that album came out, people said, "Oh, this is Prince's Sergeant Pepper." The iconic guitar solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps when George was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, oh look, yeah, you've got a visceral physical response to that one.
Just unbelievable. And I can see it right now. Prince's solo and Danny Harrison standing there just going like
Yes,
just this massive grin on his face because he was so like, oh my God, am I here? Am I watching this?
yes, it's
Like
otherworldly.
completely. It's just and and I think musicians at that level talk about that a lot,
Mhm.
that their songs, they're like they come to me from somewhere else.
Yeah,
Like I am a conduit for something way bigger. And I Prince had that, and the Beatles had that. But also, like, I don't want to negate, like, by saying that there are these, I don't know, sometimes godlike figures,
hmm,
rock gods, and that they're just such genius. I don't want to negate what got them there.
yeah,
Because, like, I just actually last week finished the Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers. I'm a little
yes.
late to that party,
That's okay. You're
but
invited.
all right. But when he talks about, he uses the Beatles and he talks about their Hamburg years being really pivotal and necessary for their explosion and for their growth as musicians. So when people say that they're, you know, otherworldly,
Mhm.
it's a yes and. Like, yes, and let's not take away the fact that these people, these four people, well, ultimately four, but there's
Hmm.
Pete and Stu and whatever. There, that was so much work,
Yes.
so much hard work to hone their craft and to become the best of the best. So I don't want to take away from that.
That is true. I mean, when John and Paul got together and started writing songs, they didn't write A Day in the Life. They didn't write Hey Jude. They didn't write, Let It Be. The same thing with Warhol. He didn't start painting Campbell soup cans. I mean,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
there is an origin story that a lot of the great artists have, that there's a certain level of identification, I think, that's appealing. Hamburg and the Beatles, and they were just a working bar band, and they struggled, and they had failures and flops, and they're not quite yet the Beatles. They're not quite yet Sergeant Pepper's band. They're not quite yet on the rooftop. And there's something to be said about that effort and that honing of that vision.
yeah. I think um I think a lot of that like I teach high school French and AP Art History,
Mhm.
dual certified.
Love it.
So when I teach in AP Art History, a lot of times when we get to modern art, the response is really polarizing, I think.
Hmm.
In modern art, people see that and they're like, what is that? Is that art? I can do that.
Right.
On and on. And I'm like, you need to understand the backstory because so many artists, like I'll take Vasily Kandinsky, whom I love, an abstract expressionist, he was classically trained first. He learned how to paint the pretty pictures, how to
Mhm.
do the landscapes, how to paint the portraits, all of that, and then went on to create his own style. So you look at the Beatles and what were they doing at first? Well, they were playing covers
Yes.
over and over and over, these covers. And then they started writing their own songs in the style of those covers,
Right.
not super deviating from the formula. Like the earlier songs like She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, things like that. I love, but they're simpler than an Eleanor Rigby,
Hmm.
than a Hey Jude, than a Sergeant Pepper. And so they learn and practice and practice and practice and then expand it. Like that creative expanse and that creative path was phenomenal.
Yeah. And two, short-lived. So
7 years.
yeah, seven
Yeah.
years. And so when we see, we just celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show this past year, right? And there's a wonderful documentary that came out on the Disney Plus channel, Beatles
Oh, yeah.
64. Have you seen that?
Not yet. I don't have Disney,
Okay.
which is weird with small children.
I know, but anyway, we'll get we'll
Yeah.
you'll have to track down a copy or go to a neighbor's house and see it.
Yeah.
But you're looking at that footage of that iconic footage of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, February 1964, and I say to myself, being the Beatles historian geek that I am, in December of 1966, they're going to go in the studio and record Strawberry Fields Forever, which is a quantum leap, and whatever is larger or bigger than a quantum leap, a hyperspace drive into another dimension.
Universe. Yeah.
Yes. From She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, to Strawberry Fields Forever. And in between 64 and 66 is, I mean, they were cranking out albums, they were cranking out songs. And to see that, and even in the film, and for those of you, who are listening, you may know this reference. Um, there's a brief scene, you'll dig it, where Lennon, they're in a hotel room, and they're either on their way to the gig or they're touring. They're someplace. It's 1964, and Lennon is playing the melodica, and you hear him just kind of fiddling around with it. But if you listen carefully, you are hearing the opening notes to Strawberry Fields Forever. It's really weird. And then that's where I had that moment, like, wait a minute, and that's Strawberry Fields Forever. And in 2 years, they're gonna record this song, which is innovative and psychedelic and groundbreaking. It's the entry point into the Sergeant Pepper world. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah. It's and when you look at how music is made now, like who is that prolific?
Yeah.
It's part of the reason, honestly, that I'm excited about Taylor Swift. She's prolific
Yes.
and really has a lot of different, well, eras to her
Nice,
music.
nice play there. Nice play.
I mean,
Well
it was
done.
low hanging fruit, um, but the way she songwrites and plays with words and is expanding
Hmm.
what she started with to where she's going, that's exciting to me because we haven't had that a ton. Or Beyonce,
Yes.
not putting out the music at the same speed, but the creative evolution is significant.
Yeah, and you see too with Taylor Swift going back and re-recording her earlier albums, because of lawsuits and those things, and revisiting that, and not necessarily recreating, but there, there's a little bit of maturity and distance and maybe a deeper understanding of the song, which might come out maybe a slightly differently. um and the same thing with Beyonce, which is very Beatlesque as well, where we're not in R&B territory anymore. We're now going to explore and embrace country music idioms and even cover a Beatles song, Blackbird.
Blackbird,
I mean,
yeah.
which is such a powerful interpretation.
Move. Yeah, like and also I think about like what those two women are doing. Beatles did too. Like when they get to a point that they're so massive, they do things because they can. And
Yeah.
they throw their weight around in a way that I think is really positive. Like look at the Beatles refusing to play to segregated audiences
Hmm.
because they can, you know?
Yes.
Like that idea of, you know what? No, you're going to do it our way because this is the way we want it.
Aaron, that echoes the famous story from Hey Jude, where they were, the famous song Paul wrote, as a kind of a pick me up song for Julian Lennon, John's son. Uh, John was divorcing his first wife Cynthia, and we have this just kind of iconic anthem, and uh, the song is over 7 minutes long, and there was some discussion either from, I don't know who it was, saying the radio's not going to play it. The radio's not going to play this, and John, because it's 7 minutes. Nobody, Dylan got away with it with like a Rolling Stone, and that's it. And John said, "Oh, they will if it's us."
Yep. Yeah. And he's 100% right.
Yes, I mean, and you cannot hear "Hey Jude" any other way. You cannot hear it abbreviated. You have to hear all 7 minutes and 11 seconds or however long it is of that song. Anything less, it's not Hey Jude.
No.
It doesn't work. I like how you mentioned, and I always appreciate this about you, and in that you have this dual certification. You're in these two worlds of language and art, and they're not all of, and in many ways to the innocent bystander, they seem like very very dissimilar. But I would make the contention, I'm sure you would, that there's a lot of blending of language and art, and I know that you
Yeah.
play in that territory. But I would be interested. You made a reference to Kandinsky. What would you say in your art historian expertise is an artist? And the Beatles were very much influenced by visual art. John Lennon went to art school. Stu Sutcliffe, who was one of the early versions of the Beatles, was an artist, and his work has, had a little bit of renown, and now has major renown, posthumously. But who would be an artist or visual artist in your estimation that is Beatlesque, or at that level of the Beatles and their trajectory? I'm just curious.
Um, at at that level, that's hard. Um, there a few artists come to mind, but for different reasons.
Hmm.
Um, the furthest back I can think of is Michelangelo because when I teach AP art history, I when I teach Michelangelo, I'm like, all right, we're going to start off with my assertion that Michelangelo was the first punk rocker
Love it.
because Michelangelo really just he did things his own way and stood up to the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church ultimately had some wins there. They got him to paint the Sistine Chapel and he didn't want to and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But he did a lot of stick it to the man type things
Yeah.
with the Catholic Church. And I think the Beatles did that too with their work. And like, we're going to do it our way because we're the ones with the skill.
Hmm.
And so that there's that connection. But I also think big a movement that comes to mind is the abstract expressionists of the early 1900s because they were doing real explosions with color. And I think about the Beatles in that way because they were just, I think their lyrics often were just so vivid,
Yes.
so vivid, so vivid. And Vasily Kandinsky had synesthesia, which incidentally Dave Grohl has.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Vasily would, it's like when your senses are mixed. So instead of seeing color like everybody, and he could do that too, he would hear it.
Yes.
And so he'd listen to music and paint what he heard. So fun connection that I have to that is that I just remember from a really young age being mesmerized by the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds
Mhm.
because it's so visual.
It is.
Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Like, what would that look like? And as a art student in college, I was like, I have to do a piece of art with that. I have to do a piece of art. And ultimately, years later, I did. So it's a collage. It's six different panels of one panel per each verse and one for the
Nice.
chorus. Because I was like, this is visual, it needs color, it needs psychedelic imagery, but that still makes sense.
Hmm.
And the Beatles were that way, I think, with their words, in particular in the later years, just very visual.
That's cool. I'd love to see that artwork. Do you have it
It's in
around?
front of me now.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah. I'll send you a picture.
Oh, very, very cool. Um, I've made no secret that Let It Be is my favorite Beatles album, and I for lots of reasons, and one, it's the underdog of the Beatles canon that does not get a lot of love. Um, but I have a very personal connection to that album. The first one being we both came out on the same day, May 8th, 1970.
Hey.
So I very much appreciate that album for that connection because I have friends who are a little bit older than me who will say that, I was around when the Beatles were, I was born in 68, 69, or whatever, and you weren't. And I say, no, 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 no. I'm a first generation Beatles fan. I was in the same world when the last album at the time, the last, album, official album came out. So I'm a first generation fan. So I'm going to claim that. But for you, what album or albums for you do you have a visceral connection?
Well, funny thing, you mentioned Let It Be. I have on my Beatles sweatshirt now with the Let
Nice.
It Be.
Love it.
Yeah. Um, Sergeant Pepper is, an easy one, right?
Mhm,
That's just real great experimentation there, I think,
mhm.
in the songs. But also an album for me that stands out, it, maybe just for me, is Rubber Soul.
Yeah.
I think it was the first Beatles album I had on vinyl.
Wow.
So that it meant something. And seeing that image on the cover and the like bubble letters of Rubber Soul. And so for me, like I connected to it like artistically. Well, same thing with the Sgt. Pepper cover. I mean, that's a cool cover. But yeah, like I think my connection is to Rubber Soul isn't necessarily the music on the album, but what that album meant. Like my first one.
And if I may, not to turn this into a psychoanalysis, but yes, the album cover, that's kind of in many ways, I would interpret Rubber Soul as like a work of art, and whether or not it was intentional or not, but from, as you said, the graphics, the picture, how that album cover, was formed. But I would also say too, um, um, I'm gonna butcher the French language here, so je suis désolé.
Oh, ça va.
But mais les not étudiants du français, oui, les
Yeah,
étudiants
yeah.
du français, um, with the song Michelle being
Michelle.
a
Yeah,
song
yeah.
that is partially in French and English, and both of those sensibilities, with your love of French language and your
Yep.
expertise in that, your love of art and your expertise in that, all kind of come together. Ooh,
Yeah. Yeah.
on that album.
Yep. And like Michelle isn't even like my favorite. I wouldn't even come at close to the top of my favorite Beatles songs, but I love that Paul sang in two languages.
Yeah,
I mean, who was doing that,
yeah,
you know,
that's
and
true.
getting radio play for it?
Yeah, it was a hit.
There, yeah. So that's significant.
Yeah, there's and I also love that Rubber Soul, and depending on what version you listen to, whether it was the British version or the American version, that album was the catalyst for a lot of other great works, namely Pet Sounds,
Yeah.
Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and how he heard, Rubber Soul, and said, "My God, they've made the greatest album of all time." And he went to the Beach Boys and said, "Well, what are we going to do?" And so they made Pet Sounds, and then Lennon and McCartney heard Pet Sounds and said, "They've made the greatest album of all time. What are we going to do?" And they do Sergeant Pepper.
Yeah, that call and response is amazing.
It is,
Yeah.
which, in many ways, let's face it, going back to Prince and thinking of call and response, which again is a big part of his music as well, but also, he is responding to James Brown. He is responding to Miles Davis. He is responding to, Parliament Funkadelic. He's responding to Marvin Gaye. He's responding to Billie Holiday. He's responding to the Beatles and so
Mhm.
on and so on. And he's absorbing, these influences, right? And they're fueling him to take music to another level, or they're emboldening him to create this just vast, because again, I know you're a Prince fan, so
Yeah.
this kind of vast, array of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, on Rubber Soul, one of my all-time favorite Beatles songs is In My Life.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like, you know, everyone should have that at their funeral.
Yeah,
Like, it's just beautiful.
it is. It and it, it's poetry set to music, with a beautiful nod to Bach and George Martin's piano solo, which was sped up to sound like a harpsichord, and the harmonies, and you know in many ways a breakthrough in songwriting for John Lennon, and being taking kind of his first steps in exploring the self and the singer-songwriter movement, and being confessional, which is a big it's a big part of his work, and exposing himself and exploring himself, in song. And In My Life is in many ways kind of the first step into that world of his.
Well, and you think about how young he was writing that. I mean, it seems like very wise beyond your years, to ref it because it feels like a reflecting back on
Mm.
a really long life. And he didn't have a long life
No,
in general, or clearly when he wrote the song. Um, but you talk about that songwriter movement, and that's so key. Like when they were first starting, so much of what was happening at that time, like with Elvis, like Elvis wasn't writing his own songs,
no.
you know, they were cranked out by like Brill building writers and all of that. And we might still be arguably in a period of time where, we turn up our noses a little bit to people who don't write their own songs, but it's phases of artistry in music where there was a phase of you don't write your own songs. There's the songwriters and the performers. But then when the Beatles really got into pushing that songwriting movement forward, that allowed for so many other people to have the doors open for them to do it. And then, we went into a period of time where it's like, let's use 10 different people to write one song and
Yeah.
nobody's just writing their own, but they're phases.
Yeah, and you know although Michelangelo chiseled David by
Mhm.
himself, and he, for the most part, he had some help and assistance, and the same thing with the Sistine Chapel. You're right, there is something to be said about, and maybe this is the testament to why they last so long, these Mozarts, these Michelangelo, Joni Mitchell, Dylan, the Beatles, is there's a level of individuality that's coming from them. There's a singularity of vision, that's there, even though most of the all of the Beatles songs that were any kind of hits outside of George Harrison and Ringo Starr were credited to Lennon and McCartney. Well, you know Hey Jude was 95% written by McCartney, and Lennon may have made a contribution here or there. But again, I think it does echo a little bit about what you said about artists, and this, what I'm taking of is this kind of singularity of vision, as opposed to now you have films that are written by committee. There are certain albums and songs by popular artists, that are written, overly written perhaps, and overly produced perhaps by committee. It's not, here's James Taylor with a guitar just singing Fire and Rain, or Joni Mitchell singing both sides now. There's I think we've lost a lot of that.
Yeah. Well, and when you know that the artist or artists, the band, is writing their own songs, it personalizes it
Yeah.
and lets the listener interact in a very different way when they know, like, this is actually coming from these people. Not that it necessarily that the songs have to be like a first person narrative of their own life.
Mhm.
No, like maybe they're writing about their neighbor's story, whatever, but it's filtered through them and their own mind and their own heart. And knowing that, like the Beatles, when I think about their work, just I keep on coming back to that idea of from the beginning to the end, that theme of love is in it
Mhm.
all the way through. And that is just, that's it. That's the thing. Like, that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
And the Beatles were writing it because they were feeling it. It wasn't coming from someone else.
Mhm.
It was them that's putting that out there. And when you're putting forth music that has as a real defining piece of it the strongest emotion possible, you're going to move people.
That's a beautiful place to press pause in our conversation, our ongoing conversation on the Beatles. Erin, I have greatly valued our conversation, and thank you for sharing why the Beatles matter to you and all of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I'm just very, very grateful right now. What's the best way for folks to connect with you and follow with you? I know you're a bit of a writer yourself. I know
Mhm.
that you are presenting and you've got
Mhm.
all kinds of things percolating.
Yeah. Um, I'm in the classroom and also present at conferences around the country. I have a couple books published through Routledge. Global education is a big passion of mine. So my latest book, Going Global in the World Language Classroom,
Mhm.
is about to be uh, the book of choice for the World Language Teachers Book Club
Nice.
with ICLS. So I'm excited about that. I'm trying to transition from Twitter. I don't want to call it that single letter to Blue Sky. So I'm trying to do more on Blue Sky, also on LinkedIn.
I'll be
Um,
I'll be sure to share all those links to your books and Blue Sky and LinkedIn in our show notes. And I got to tell you, I'm just so again as I'm grateful, but I'm also envious of your students who get to sit in your world language class, French class, and art history class. I've felt so edified and fulfilled in learning with you during our time together. So you know, uh, I'm jealous of your students. I want to be a student in your class.
right on, right on. We would love to have you, Sean.
Yeah.
And before we wrap up, there's one thing I just want to add because I was thinking about this conversation for a while and I thought like, like what do I love about the Beatles? And I just came back to that scene in Almost Famous at the very end when William finally gets to interview Russell and he says, "Russell, what do you love about music?" And Russell leans in and he goes, "To begin with, everything."
Thing.
And that's, I think, how we both feel about the Beatles. Like, what do
Yeah.
you love about them? Everything, even the things that are most decidedly not perfect.
Yeah, that, and that's a good answer. It really is because it's hard for me to say like I don't have a favorite Beatle. I mean, I do have a favorite album that I have a personal connection to, but I'm just as happy listening to Beatles for Sale, or take 47 of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and or even a cover version, Elton John's version of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. There's so much in their story and in their saga and in their canon that as you said, it goes back to love, and we see a little bit of ourselves in that band, and there's things that we can latch onto that validate our feelings, uh, or enrich our thinking, or expand our minds. And and to me, that just doesn't make the reason why the Beatles are great or why they matter. It's why art, capital A, matters, and why it endures, because you're able to find something to latch on, even if you're staring up at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and you have no clue what you're looking at. But when you learn that, man, this dude Michelangelo painted this thing on his back under duress, and didn't want to paint it, right? And kept saying to Pope Julius, "I'm a sculptor. I can't do this." All of us have had our own version of that in some way, shape, or form. Maybe we're not literally painting stuff on our back, but we've all done stuff that we don't want to do, or we've hesitated to do, or we've been pushed to do, and then it turns out, oh, that is kind of a masterpiece, or uh, not bad. I mean, that's what makes art great.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
glad I'm glad that you brought that up. So I appreciate that reflection being shared. Erin, wherever you go, I will follow. And I'm just so grateful for you and our time together, and our shared mutual love for the Beatles, and all things art. And now I've got to go review for the umpteenth time, gladly, the film Almost Famous, Cameron Crowe's
So
masterpiece.
good.
It
So
is so,
good.
so good. There's so many great that's a whole nother podcast episode.
Yes.
It really
Yeah.
is. Because we could go down a rabbit hole with that
Oh,
film.
yeah.
I mean, there's just so
Yeah.
many good, there's so many great moments in that film.
Just
So
nuggets hidden
yes,
everywhere.
yes. And that line, Billy Crudup um nails it,
Yep.
and yeah, to begin with everything.
Everything.
So, well, on that note, this is why the Beatles matter. This is Sean Gaylord with my good friend and thought partner and common fan in the Beatles, Aaron Austin. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks to Aaron. And as always, stay fab.